On the 8th of July, 1853, 4 black ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of Japan. They were unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. No sails caught the wind, no oars disturbed the water. Yet they moved forward against tide and current, trailing smoke from metal chimneys that rose like dark fingers against the sky. The vessels carried a man named Commodore Matthew Perry, and with him, they carried the end of an era. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For 220 years, Japan had existed in almost perfect isolation. The Tokugawa shogunate had closed the country to foreigners in 1639, permitting only a single Dutch trading post on a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. It was deliberate, calculated isolation. The shoguns had watched Christianity spread through their lands, had seen how foreign merchants brought not just goods, but ideas that threatened their control. So they sealed the borders. Anyone who left Japan could never return. Anyone who came uninvited faced execution. For more than 2 centuries this policy held. The world changed outside. Revolutions came and went. Empires rose and fell. Steam engines transformed commerce. But Japan remained frozen, a feudal society of samurai and rice farmers, as if time itself had stopped at their shores. Perry's arrival shattered that stillness like a stone through glass. The Japanese called his vessels the Black Ships of Evil. They had reason for such names. When Perry anchored in Edo Bay, he ordered his cannon fired as a salute. 13 guns roared across the water. The sound alone terrified the Japanese observers who had never heard such thunder. The cannonballs, fired in demonstration, travelled further than any Japanese weapon could reach. They understood instantly what this meant. Their entire fleet, their coastal defences, their 2 centuries of careful isolation, all of it could be destroyed in an afternoon by these smoking giants. Perry delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore. The message was polite, but the meaning was clear. Open your ports to trade, or we will open them for you. Then he sailed away, promising to return the following year for an answer. The shogunate faced an impossible choice. They could refuse and face destruction, or they could agree and watch their entire social order collapse. Either way, the world they had known was finished. When Perry returned in February 1854 with even more ships, Japan had no choice but to sign. The Treaty of Kanagawa opened 2 ports to American vessels. More treaties followed with Britain, Russia, and France. Each one carved away more sovereignty, more control. The Japanese watched as China, once the greatest power in Asia, suffered defeat after humiliating defeat at the hands of European powers. The Opium Wars had turned the proud Qing dynasty into a semi-colonial puppet. Treaty ports dotted Chinese coasts where foreigners lived under their own laws, immune to Chinese authority. The Japanese saw what happened to nations that couldn't defend themselves in this new world. They saw, and they were terrified. This terror drove what came next. In 1868, a coalition of young samurai overthrew the shogunate and restored imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. But this was no simple power transfer. It was a revolution disguised as restoration. The young leaders who seized control understood something profound. Japan had perhaps 30 years before the Western powers returned to carve up their islands as they had carved up China. 30 years to accomplish what had taken Europe 2 centuries. 30 years to transform a feudal society into an industrial power capable of defending itself. The clock was ticking. Consider for a moment the scale of what they attempted. Japan, in 1868, had no factories, no railroads, no telegraph lines. Most Japanese had never seen a photograph, let alone a steam engine. The samurai class still wore swords and practiced with bows. Rice cultivation methods had remained unchanged for centuries. The entire nation ran on muscle power, human and animal. Yet within 3 decades, they would build an industrial economy capable of challenging Western empires. How does a nation compress 200 years of development into 30? The answer lies in choices so extreme they border on desperation. The Meiji government consumed 80% of the national budget on military modernization and industrial development. 80%. Rice farmers starved to fund the construction of battleships. Villages emptied as young men were conscripted to build railroads and work in factories. Traditional industries collapsed as the government forced modernization on every sector of society. They imported foreign experts by the thousands. British naval officers trained Japanese sailors. German advisors restructured the army. American engineers built railways. French legal scholars wrote new law codes. The Japanese absorbed it all with furious intensity, studying, copying, improving. But technology was the easy part. You can buy factories. You can hire foreign experts. You can reverse engineer Western machines. The harder transformation was cultural. The Meiji leaders understood that Western power rested on more than just technology. It rested on social structures, on educational systems, on ways of thinking that were fundamentally different from traditional Japan. So they attempted something unprecedented. They tried to change their entire society's consciousness within a single generation. The samurai class was abolished. Imagine that. For 700 years, the samurai had been Japan's ruling warrior elite. They lived by Bushido, the way of the warrior. Their swords were sacred. Their honor was everything. Now the government told them to put away their swords, to cut their top knots, to become bureaucrats and factory managers and school teachers. Many resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 saw 40,000 samurai take up arms against the new order. They fought with traditional weapons and tactics against a conscript army armed with rifles. The samurai were slaughtered. The last of the old world died on those battlefields, cut down by farmers' sons wielding modern weapons. Education became a national obsession. Before the Meiji Restoration, literacy rates varied wildly, perhaps 40% in cities, far less in rural areas. By 1900, Japan had achieved nearly universal literacy. They built schools in every village. They made attendance compulsory. They standardized textbooks that taught not just reading and mathematics, but loyalty to the emperor and the necessity of national strength. Children learned that Japan must modernize or perish. This was education as survival strategy. The military transformation was equally dramatic. In 1873, Japan created a conscript army on the Prussian model. Every young man would serve, regardless of birth or class. This was revolutionary. For centuries, warfare had been the exclusive domain of the samurai. Now, farmers and merchants would carry rifles. The new army was equipped with modern weapons, trained in European tactics, organized along Western lines. The navy underwent even more dramatic change. Japan's first modern warship was purchased from Britain. Japanese engineers studied it obsessively, learning every detail. Soon they were building their own vessels in Japanese shipyards. By the 1890s, Japan possessed a navy that could challenge any power in Asia. Yet even as they modernized, the Japanese faced a cruel paradox. They were adopting Western technology and organization, but they would never be Western, no matter how many factories they built, no matter how many battleships they launched. European powers viewed them as inferior. The racism was explicit and unapologetic. Western newspapers published cartoons of Japanese as monkeys in military uniforms. Diplomats spoke openly of the yellow peril. This was the era of scientific racism, when European scholars published treatises proving white racial superiority. Japan could modernize their military, but they couldn't change their faces. This rejection would poison everything that followed. Japanese leaders believed that if they played by Western rules, if they became strong enough, wealthy enough, modern enough, they would be accepted as equals. This was the promise implicit in modernization. Become like us, and you can join us. But it was a lie. The Western powers had no intention of accepting Japan as an equal, no matter how thoroughly they modernized. This bitter truth would take decades to fully reveal itself, but its seeds were planted from the beginning. Still, Japan pressed forward. They had no choice. The alternative was colonization. By the 1890s, almost all of Asia and Africa had fallen under European control. The great empires carved the world into spheres of influence with casual brutality. The British controlled India and were expanding into Southeast Asia. The French had taken Indochina. The Dutch dominated Indonesia. The Germans were claiming territories in the Pacific. Even tiny Belgium had seized the Congo, a territory 80 times its own size. The age of imperialism was reaching its peak, and there were only two types of nations, those with empires and those that were empires. Japan looked at this world and made a decision. They would join the imperial game, not from choice, but from necessity. In the brutal calculus of the late 19th century, expansion meant survival. A nation that didn't grow would be consumed. Resources, markets, security all required territory. Japan, with its limited land and scarce resources, needed an empire simply to sustain its modernization. This was the logic that would drive Japanese expansion for the next half-century, the logic that would lead eventually to Pearl Harbor. But first, they had to prove they belonged in the game. They had to demonstrate that an Asian nation could compete with European powers on their own terms. That proof would come in blood and iron, in two wars that shocked the world and set Japan on a path toward both greatness and catastrophe. The young samurai who had overthrown the shogunate, who had bet everything on rapid modernization, were about to discover if their gamble would pay off. The black ships had arrived just 40 years before. Now Japan would build black ships of its own and sail them to war. The First Sino-Japanese War began on July 25, 1894, and it began with a lie. Japanese naval forces attacked Chinese troop transports near the Korean coast before any declaration of war had been issued. This was no accident. Japan had learned from the West that wars between civilized nations required certain formalities, but they had also learned that victory mattered more than etiquette. The attack worked. Chinese soldiers drowned by the hundreds as their ships sank in the Yellow Sea. Japan's modernization was about to face its first test, and they had chosen to begin with treachery. Korea was the prize. The peninsula jutted from the Asian mainland toward Japan like a dagger pointed at the heart of the home islands. For centuries, Korea had been a tributary state of China, acknowledging Chinese supremacy while maintaining internal autonomy. But Korea was also desperately close to Japan, separated by less than 120 miles of water at the nearest point. Whoever controlled Korea could threaten Japan directly. The Japanese knew this. They also knew that Korea was weak, corrupt, and ripe for domination. If Japan was going to build an empire, Korea was the obvious first step. China saw things differently. Korea had been in their sphere of influence for 500 years. Losing Korea meant losing face, losing prestige, losing the entire tributary system that defined Chinese relations with its neighbors. More practically, it meant allowing a newly aggressive Japan to plant itself on China's doorstep. So, when Japan began interfering in Korean affairs, when they sent troops to suppress a peasant rebellion and refused to leave, China responded. Both empires sent forces to Korea. Both claimed they were protecting Korean sovereignty. Both knew they were really fighting for dominance in East Asia. The the world expected China to win. China was enormous, with a population of 400 million compared to Japan's 40 million. China had been extracting tribute from neighbours while Japan was still isolated. The Chinese military had been modernized with European advisors and equipment. The Beiyang fleet, in particular, was considered formidable. It possessed 2 battleships built in Germany, the Dingyuan and the Zhenyuan, each displacing 7,000 tons and armed with 12-inch guns. Western naval experts rated them among the most powerful warships in Asia. Japan had nothing comparable. What the world didn't understand was that surface appearances meant nothing. Yes, China had impressive ships, but maintenance was neglected. Corruption riddled the military. Ammunition budgets were embezzled. Some reports claimed that the Beiyang fleet's admiral had diverted funds meant for shells to purchase a birthday present for the Empress Dowager. Training was inadequate. Command structure was confused. China had purchased the machinery of modern warfare, but they hadn't internalized the discipline and organization that made such machinery effective. Japan, by contrast, had transformed not just their equipment, but their entire military culture. Officers studied war with religious intensity. Sailors drilled constantly. Ships were maintained to exacting standards. The Japanese had learned from the West that modern warfare required more than just weapons. It required systems, logistics, doctrine, training, and above all, the absolute commitment of every individual in the chain of command to their role in the machine. They had spent 25 years building such a system. Now they would test it. The Battle of the Yalu River began on September 17, 1894, when the Japanese combined fleet encountered the Beiyang fleet, escorting troopships to Korea. The Chinese had numerical superiority, 10 major warships to the Japanese 12. They had the 2 powerful German-built battleships, but from the moment the first shots were fired, the outcome was never in doubt. The Japanese fleet moved in coordinated formation, maintaining discipline under fire, concentrating their attacks with devastating precision. The Chinese fleet fell into chaos almost immediately. Ships fired independently. Without coordination, some vessels fled. Others charged forward without support. The 2 battleships, for all their impressive armor and guns, were slow and couldn't keep up with the faster Japanese cruisers. The battle lasted 5 hours. When it ended, the Beiyang fleet had lost 4 ships sunk and 3 more damaged beyond repair. Over 1,000 Chinese sailors were dead. The Japanese fleet remained intact, with only minor damage to a few vessels and fewer than 200 casualties. It was not merely a victory, it was a revelation. An Asian nation using Western technology and tactics had destroyed a Chinese fleet equipped and advised by Europeans. The old order, where China stood at the center of the Asian world, had been shattered in a single afternoon. The war continued for 9 more months, but the Yalu River battle had decided everything. Japanese armies advanced through Korea and into Manchuria, winning battle after battle. They captured the fortress of Port Arthur, slaughtering thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians in an orgy of violence that shocked Western observers. They besieged and took Weihai Wei, capturing what remained of the Beiyang fleet. By March 1895, Japanese forces were positioned to march on Beijing itself. China sued for peace. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed on April 17, 1895, marked Japan's arrival as an imperial power. China recognized Korean independence, which everyone understood meant Japanese control. China ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan. China paid an indemnity of 200 million silver taels, an astronomical sum that nearly bankrupted the Qing treasury. And China ceded the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, giving Japan a foothold on the Asian mainland. Japan had won everything. They had defeated the ancient empire that had dominated Asia for millennia. They had seized territory and extracted crushing payments. They had demonstrated beyond. I doubt that modernization had succeeded, that an Asian nation could master Western methods and use them to build an empire. The Meiji gamble had paid off. Or so it seemed for 10 days. On April 23rd, just 6 days after the treaty was signed, Germany, France, and Russia delivered a joint ultimatum to Japan. They called it the Triple Intervention. The message was clear and insulting. Japan must return the Liaodong Peninsula to China. Russia wanted Port Arthur for its own purposes. France and Germany supported Russia for their own imperial reasons. All three were determined that Japan should not gain a permanent foothold on the Asian mainland. The Western powers had allowed Japan to defeat China, but they would not allow Japan to actually benefit from that victory. Japan had no choice but to comply. They had defeated China, but they could not fight 3 European empires. So they returned the Liaodong Peninsula, accepted an additional indemnity payment as compensation, and we swallowed their humiliation. The Japanese people were outraged. They had sacrificed and bled to win that territory. Now it was taken from them by diplomatic pressure, by the same Western powers that Japan had tried so hard to emulate. The bitterness ran deep. That bitterness turned to rage 3 years later, when Russia, having forced Japan to give up Port Arthur, simply took it for themselves. In 1898, Russia leased the Liaodong Peninsula from China and established a naval base at Port Arthur. The hypocrisy was stunning. Russia had claimed Japan's possession of Port Arthur threatened regional peace. Now Russia possessed it instead, and nobody objected. The message to Japan was unmistakable. The rules that governed relations between Western powers did not apply to Asian nations, no matter how modernized. Japan could win wars, could follow international law, could adopt European customs and institutions, but they would never be treated as equals. This realization transformed Japanese strategy. If they would never be accepted by the Western powers, they would have to become so strong that acceptance became irrelevant. They would have to build such military might that no combination of European powers would dare challenge them. The defeat of China had been just the beginning. Now they set their sights on a far more dangerous opponent. Russia's expansion in East Asia represented everything Japan feared. The Russians were building the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would allow them to move armies from Europe to Asia in weeks instead of months. They were establishing settlements in Manchuria and pressuring Korea. They had the largest army in the world and a growing Pacific fleet based at Port Arthur. If Russia continued expanding, Japan would be encircled, cut off from the Asian mainland, reduced to an island fortress with no room to grow and no resources to sustain industrial development. Japan faced a choice: accept Russian dominance and become a secondary power, or fight while they still had a chance. The decision seems obvious in retrospect, but consider the audacity of what Japan was contemplating. Russia was a European great power with 130 million people, nearly 3 times Japan's population. Russia sprawled across 2 continents, possessing vast resources and an army of over 1 million men. Russia had crushed Napoleon and dominated European politics for a century. The idea that an Asian nation could defeat such an empire seemed absurd. Yet Japan prepared for war with meticulous care, learning from their mistakes in the Sino-Japanese War, studying Russian weaknesses, planning every detail of an operation so bold it bordered on madness. The Russo-Japanese War began, like the war with China, with a surprise attack. On February 8, 1904, Japanese torpedo boats struck the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before any declaration of war. 3 Russian battleships were damaged in the first minutes of fighting. The next day, Japan formally declared war. Once again, they had chosen to begin with treachery, and once again, it worked. The Russian Pacific Fleet was crippled at the start, giving Japan naval superiority. The war that followed stunned the world. Japanese armies landed in Korea and Manchuria, pushing Russian forces back in battle after battle. The siege of Port Arthur lasted 5 months and cost over 50,000 Japanese casualties, but Japan took the fortress. At the Battle of Mukden, the largest land battle fought since Leipzig in 1813, 247,000 Japanese troops defeated 293,000 Russians in a struggle that lasted 10 days. The casualties were horrific. Japan lost 70,000 men killed or wounded. Russia lost 90,000, but Japan won, and the Russian army retreated in disorder. Then came the Battle of Tsushima Strait, and with it, one of the most complete naval victories in history. Russia's Baltic fleet had sailed halfway around the world to relieve Port Arthur. It was an epic voyage of 18,000 miles that took 7 months. 38 warships, including 8 battleships, departed from the Baltic Sea in October 1904. They sailed down the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, through the Straits of Southeast Asia, and finally approached Japanese waters in May 1905. They were exhausted, their ships fouled by months at sea, their crews sick and demoralized. Admiral Togo Heihachiro was waiting for them. The battle lasted less than 2 days. The Japanese fleet was faster, better trained, and fought in home waters where every advantage lay with them. Togo's flagship led the attack with the signal, "The fate of the empire rests on this battle. Let every man do his utmost." They did. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, 7 captured, and 6 escaped to neutral ports where they were interned. Only 4 vessels made it back to Russian waters. Over 4,000 Russian sailors died. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats and 117 men. It was not a battle, it was annihilation. The world reacted with shock that bordered on disbelief. An Asian nation had destroyed a European fleet. An Asian army had defeated a European power on land and sea. The racial implications were staggering. For centuries, Europeans had justified imperialism through claims of racial superiority. Now those claims lay in ruins at the bottom of Tsushima Strait. If Japan could defeat Russia, what did that mean for European empires ruling over hundreds of millions of Asian and African subjects? What did it mean for the entire imperial project? The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt, ended the war on September 5, 1905. Japan gained control of Korea, which they would annex 5 years later. They acquired the southern half of Sakhalin Island. They took over Russian leases in southern Manchuria, including Port Arthur. Russia paid no indemnity, which disappointed the Japanese public, but the strategic gains were immense. Japan had secured its position in East Asia. They had proven they could defeat a European power. They had earned, they believed, the right to be treated as an equal among the great powers. The world seemed to agree. At first, Theodore Roosevelt praised Japan's military prowess. British leaders spoke admiringly of Japanese discipline and courage. European newspapers published analyses of how Japan had achieved such remarkable victories. It seemed that Japan had finally broken through the barrier of racial prejudice through sheer force of arms. They had proven themselves in the currency that empires understood, military power. Surely now they would be accepted as equals. But underneath the praise, old prejudices remained. Western leaders might admire Japanese military efficiency, but they still saw Japanese as fundamentally different, fundamentally inferior. The yellow peril rhetoric actually intensified after Tsushima. If Japan could defeat Russia, couldn't they threaten European colonies throughout Asia? Couldn't they challenge white supremacy everywhere? Fear and admiration mixed into a toxic combination. Japan was strong enough to be dangerous, but still not white enough to be truly equal. This truth would become explicit 14 years later at a conference table in Versailles, where Japan would finally learn that no amount of military victory could earn them the respect they sought. But that revelation still lay ahead. In 1905, Japan stood triumphant, having achieved in 40 years what seemed impossible, transforming from isolated feudal society to imperial power. They had played the game by Western rules and won. The cost had been staggering, the changes wrenching, the sacrifices immense. But they had survived. They had modernized. They had built an empire. The question now was whether that would be enough. There is an equation that explains Pearl Harbor better than any discussion of honor, strategy, or imperial ambition. It is simple arithmetic, the kind that keeps military planners awake at night. Japan is an island nation roughly the size of California. In 1940, 65 million people lived on these islands. They possessed less than 7% of the industrial resources required to sustain a modern military and economy. 7%. That number is everything. Consider what that means. Steel production, the foundation of industrial warfare, requires iron ore and coal. Japan had some coal, but almost no iron ore. They imported 90% of their iron from foreign sources. Oil, which powered every ship, every plane, every truck in the modern military, had to be imported entirely. Japan possessed virtually no domestic oil production. Rubber for tires, for gaskets, for countless military applications, grew only in tropical regions that Japan did not control. Even food, the most basic resource, had to be imported to feed the population. Japan could not feed itself, could not fuel itself, could not arm itself without resources from outside its borders. This was not a new problem. Japanese leaders had understood their resource poverty since the Meiji Restoration. It was why they built an empire in the first place. Korea provided rice and some minerals. Taiwan supplied sugar and agricultural products. The territories seized from Russia and Manchuria offered more space, more resources, more breathing room. But even with these possessions, Japan remained desperately dependent on imports from regions they did not control. The empire they had built was not sufficient. It could never be sufficient as long as the resources they needed lay in lands controlled by Western powers. The solution seemed obvious. Expand further. Manchuria bordered on Soviet Siberia and Chinese territory, rich in coal and iron. Southeast Asia possessed oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in Malaya, rice in Indochina. If Japan could control these regions, they could achieve something approaching self-sufficiency. They could break free from dependence on Western trade. This was not mere greed. It was survival logic. A nation that cannot feed or fuel itself is not truly independent, no matter how powerful its military might appear. So Japan expanded. In 1931, they created a puppet state in Manchuria called Manchukuo. The Japanese army engineered an incident, blamed Chinese forces, and used it as pretext to occupy the entire region. The League of Nations condemned the action. Japan withdrew from the League. In 1937, they launched a full-scale invasion of China, beginning the Second Sino-Japanese War. The fighting was brutal beyond description. The rape of Nanking, where Japanese troops murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians, remains one of history's most horrific atrocities. But from the Japanese military perspective, China represented resources, space, and the buffer zone they needed against Soviet expansion. Yet even as Japan conquered vast territories in China, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. China's resources were inland, difficult to exploit, contested by Chinese resistance. The real prizes lay to the south: oil in the Dutch East Indies, rubber in British Malaya, rice in French Indochina. These regions were close, poorly defended, rich beyond measure. There was just one problem. They belonged to Western colonial powers, and taking them meant war with nations that possessed industrial capacity that dwarfed Japan's own. The statistics were terrifying. The United States alone produced 63% of the world's oil. America's steel production exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1. In aircraft manufacturing, the disparity was even worse. Japan could build perhaps 5,000 planes per year at maximum effort. America's potential production, if factories converted to military manufacture, was essentially unlimited. Japan's entire merchant marine was smaller than America's reserve shipping. In every measurable category of industrial strength, the United States was simply incomparable. Fighting America was not a military challenge. It was mathematical suicide. Japanese military planners knew these numbers intimately. They ran the calculations repeatedly, searching for some scenario where Japan could prevail in a prolonged conflict with the United States. Every analysis reached the same conclusion. Impossible. Japan might win initial battles through surprise and superior training. They might capture territory while America mobilized. But once American industry fully engaged, once the factories began producing at capacity, Japan would be crushed under the sheer weight of material. The only question was how long the crushing would take. Yet Japan continued down the path toward confrontation. Why? Because the alternative seemed worse. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the United States imposed a total embargo on oil exports to Japan. Britain and the Dutch East Indies joined the embargo. 90% of Japan's oil was cut off in a single stroke, 80% of their iron, 100% of the additives needed for aviation fuel. The embargo was an economic death sentence, delivered with bureaucratic precision. Japan had reserves. Military planners calculated they possessed 18 months of oil at current consumption rates. 18 months. After that, the Navy would be unable to operate. The Air Force would be grounded, the Army would lose mobility, the industrial economy would collapse. The empire would die not from military defeat, but from simple inability to function. 18 months was not an abstract concern. It was a clock ticking toward national paralysis. The reserves, the situation was even worse for specific materials. Aluminum stocks would last approximately 12 months. Bauxite needed to produce more aluminum, perhaps 9 months. These were not the kind of shortages that could be managed through rationing or efficiency. These were existential shortages that would render modern warfare impossible. Japan's military, modernized at such cost over 70 years, would become as obsolete as the samurai swords that had been melted down to make steel for battleships. Faced with this equation, Japanese leaders confronted an impossible choice. They could submit to American demands, withdraw from China, abandon the puppet state in Manchukuo, give up all the territory conquered at such cost over the past decade. This would restore trade, but it would also mean accepting permanent inferiority, permanent dependence on Western goodwill for access to basic resources. Everything the Meiji Restoration had fought to prevent, all the sacrifices made to achieve, independence and respect, would be surrendered in an afternoon of diplomatic capitulation, or they could fight. They could seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rice paddies of Burma and Indochina before their reserves ran out. This would mean war with Britain, with the Netherlands, and almost certainly with the United States. It would mean fighting enemies with overwhelming industrial superiority. But it would also mean, perhaps, securing the resources needed for long-term survival. It would mean refusing to accept permanent subservience to Western powers. Some leaders argued for compromise. Prince Konoe, the Prime Minister, desperately sought a diplomatic solution. He proposed a summit with President Roosevelt, face-to-face negotiations that might find middle ground. But the Americans were not interested in compromise. They saw Japan's actions in China as unconscionable. They believed, correctly, that Japanese expansion threatened American interests throughout Asia. They calculated, also correctly, that time was on America's side. Every month of embargo weakened Japan further. Why negotiate when patience would force Japan to accept any terms offered? The military faction, led by General Tojo Hideki, saw the situation differently. They looked at the 18-month timeline and knew that hesitation meant slow death. If war was inevitable, and they believed it was, then better to fight while reserves remained than to wait until the tanks stopped running and planes couldn't fly. Better to strike first, seize the initiative, grab the resources while they still had the strength to do so. The gambler's logic: we will probably lose, but we will certainly lose if we don't bet everything now. In October 1941, Prince Konoe resigned. Tojo became Prime Minister. The decision was made, though not yet announced. Japan would go to war, not because they were confident of victory, but because all other options seemed to guarantee defeat. They would strike south toward the resources they needed. They would attack the European colonies, while those powers were distracted by war in Europe. And they would have to deal with the United States Pacific Fleet, the only force capable of interfering with their southern advance. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japan needed oil. Oil was in the south. America's fleet in Hawaii could threaten any southern advance. Therefore, America's fleet had to be neutralized. There was no malice in this calculation, no particular animosity toward America. It was just math. The same math that showed Japan couldn't win a prolonged war also showed that the first move had to cripple American power in the Pacific long enough for Japan to seize what it needed and dig in so deeply that America might accept. Negotiated peace rather than pay the cost of digging them out. It was a desperate plan based on desperate arithmetic. Every calculation showed it would probably fail. But when the alternative is certain death, people choose uncertain death and call it hope. Japan had spent 70 years racing to avoid becoming another China, another weak Asian nation carved up by Western imperialism. Now, they faced the ultimate test of whether that race had succeeded. The answer would be written in fire and blood across the Pacific, beginning with a Sunday morning in Hawaii when the mathematics of desperation finally overwhelmed the logic of caution. The 18-month clock was ticking. Japan was about to make its move. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spoke fluent English. He had studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington, traveling across America, observing its factories, its oil fields, its vast industrial capacity. He understood America in a way few Japanese officers did. He had walked through Detroit automobile plants and watched Model T Fords rolling off assembly lines at a crucific rate of one car every 90 seconds. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the shipyards of Newport News, the endless farmlands of the Midwest. He knew what America could do once it decided to act. This knowledge made him the worst possible choice to plan an attack on America, and the only possible choice. Yamamoto opposed war with the United States. He had argued against it in planning meetings, had warned that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict, had urged diplomatic solutions, even as the military faction pushed toward confrontation. But once the decision was made, once Tojo's government committed to war, Yamamoto faced a choice. He could resign in protest, or he could try to give Japan the best possible chance in an impossible situation. He chose to plan the attack he believed would fail. His strategy was simple, audacious, and borrowed directly from British Admiral Nelson. In war, Yamamoto believed, halfway measures guaranteed defeat. If you must, fight a stronger enemy, you cannot nibble at the edges. You must strike at the heart with overwhelming force, destroy the enemy's ability to resist in a single blow, and hope that the shock of that blow breaks their will to continue. The British had done this at Trafalgar, annihilating a Franco-Spanish fleet in one afternoon. Japan would attempt the same at Pearl Harbor. The plan required solving problems that seemed unsolvable. Pearl Harbor was 4,000 miles from Japan. No military operation at such distance had ever been attempted. Aircraft carriers had to steam across the Pacific undetected, maintaining absolute radio silence, navigating by dead reckoning, hoping to avoid merchant ships or fishing boats that might report their position. The margin for error was zero. If discovered even one day before the attack, the American fleet would sortie, and the entire operation would collapse into disaster. Then there was the harbour itself. Pearl Harbor was shallow, only 45 feet deep in most places. Standard aerial torpedoes, dropped from aircraft, dove to 150 feet or more, before levelling out to run toward their targets. They would bury themselves in the mud at Pearl Harbor long before reaching enemy ships. This seemed an insurmountable obstacle. Torpedoes were the most effective weapon against battleships. Without them, the attack would rely solely on bombs, which were far less likely to sink armoured vessels. Japanese engineers solved the problem through modifications so clever they bordered on genius. They attached wooden fins to torpedoes to control their depth. They adjusted the angle of approach. They practiced endlessly in Kagoshima Bay on the southern coast of Kyushu, which resembled Pearl Harbor in depth and configuration. Pilots dropped torpedoes in training runs, recovered them, analyzed the results, made adjustments, and tried again. For 6 months, they repeated this process, refining technique until they could reliably drop torpedoes that would run at less than 30 feet depth. The problem that seemed unsolvable was solved through patient, methodical engineering and training. The attack force assembled in complete secrecy, 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. These vessels represented the core of Japan's naval power. Putting all 6 carriers in one operation was an enormous gamble. If discovered and destroyed, Japan would lose its ability to project air power across the Pacific in a single afternoon. But Yamamoto insisted on overwhelming force. Half measures would leave the American fleet damaged but operational, capable of interfering with Japan's southern advance. The attack had to be devastating or it had nothing. Supporting the carriers were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers and 3 submarines. Over 400 aircraft would participate, fighters to sweep away American air resistance, dive bombers to strike ships and airfields, and torpedo bombers to deliver the killing blows to battleships. The pilots were among the most experienced in the world, veterans of combat in China, trained to perfection in months of practice. Japan was committing its best ships, its best planes, and its best men to this single operation. They departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941. The carriers left separately to avoid attention, then assembled at sea. They steamed north first, into waters where shipping was sparse, then turned east across the North Pacific. The route took them through some of the roughest seas on Earth. Waves crashed over flight decks. Men struggled to keep their footing. Aircraft had to be lashed down to prevent damage. But the northern route also kept them far from normal shipping lanes. For 12 days they maintained radio silence, navigators carefully tracking position without any electronic emissions that might be detected. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, America's Pacific, fleet rested in false security. The base held 8 battleships, the core of American naval power in the Pacific. Officers knew that relations with Japan were deteriorating. They had received warnings that war might come, but they believed, with remarkable consistency, that Japan would strike the Philippines, or Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. Pearl Harbor was too far, too well defended, too difficult a target, and besides, the Japanese couldn't pull off such an operation. The racism was explicit in intelligence assessments. Japanese pilots couldn't handle complex aircraft. Japanese planners lacked the sophistication for such a long-range attack. The Japanese would do something. Certainly, but not here. This underestimation was strategic blindness born of racial prejudice. American intelligence knew Japan possessed excellent carriers and well-trained pilots. They knew Japan had studied American bases and likely knew Pearl Harbor's layout intimately. They even had evidence that suggested Japanese interest in shallow water torpedo attacks. But the conclusion drawn was always that Japan would stick to conventional operations near their own waters. The idea that an Asian nation could pull off an operation of such daring and complexity simply didn't fit American assumptions about Japanese capabilities. December 7th, 1941 was a Sunday. Sundays were quiet days on military bases. Officers slept in. Enlisted men enjoyed a slower pace. The Pacific Fleet sat at anchor in neat rows, the way fleets always anchored in peacetime. Battleship Row held 7 of the 8 battleships present. The 8th, Pennsylvania, was in dry dock. Cruisers and destroyers occupied other berths. Airfields held aircraft parked in tidy clusters, arranged for easy maintenance rather than quick dispersal or defense. Everything was orderly, peaceful, relaxed. The Japanese strike force reached its launch point 230 miles north of Oahu at 6 o'clock that morning. The carriers turned into the wind. Flight decks swarmed with activity as crews prepared aircraft for launch. Pilots received final briefings. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave, climbed into his bomber and started the engine. Behind him, 183 aircraft prepared to launch, 49 level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters. They would launch first. A second wave of 170 aircraft would follow an hour later. At 6:15, the first fighter took off, engines roaring. One by one, aircraft lifted from carrier decks and formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. By 6:30, the entire first wave was airborne and heading south toward Oahu. Yamamoto's message to the fleet was simple. The rise or fall of the empire depends on this battle. Everyone will do their duty with utmost efforts. Fuchida led his formation through cloud and darkness. As they approached Oahu, the sun rose behind to them. Below, the island appeared peaceful, unaware. Pearl Harbor came into view. Fuchida could see battleships at anchor, exactly where intelligence reports said they would be. The entire Pacific Fleet spread beneath him like pieces on a game board. He checked his watch. 7:48 Hawaiian time. He gave the attack signal. Then he radioed back to the fleet, the 3 words that announced Japan's gamble had begun. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code meaning complete surprise had been achieved. America's Pacific Fleet was about to burn, and with it, any hope that this war might be avoided or quickly ended. Yamamoto had designed the attack he believed would fail to prevent the war he knew Japan could not win. Now his planes were diving toward battleships, and history was about to turn on the actions of the next 110 minutes. The gambler had placed his bet. The dice were in the air, and there could be no taking back what was about to happen. The bomb fell at 7:48 on a Sunday morning. It struck a seaplane ramp on Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor. The explosion was not particularly large, not particularly dramatic, but it shattered the peace of a quiet December morning and announced that the world was about to change in ways no one had imagined possible just moments before. Commander Fuchida's bomber led the first wave over the harbor. From his vantage point, he could see the entire tactical picture laid out below. 7 battleships lined up along the eastern side of Ford Island in what would forever be called Battleship Row, the 8th battleship in dry dock, cruisers at their moorings, destroyers nested together, aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. It was a target so perfect it almost seemed unreal. Every ship where intelligence said it would be, no fighters rising to intercept, no anti-aircraft fire. Complete, total, absolute surprise. Fuchida's level bombers went after the battleships, with armor-piercing bombs. These were not ordinary munitions. Japan had taken 16-inch naval shells and modified them with fins for aerial delivery. When dropped from high altitude, they gained enough velocity to punch through armored decks before exploding deep inside a ship's hull. The engineering was brilliant, the execution precise. One after another, these massive projectiles fell toward the grey shapes below. Simultaneously, torpedo bombers swept in at wave-top height. They came from multiple directions, each pilot aiming for the massive hulls of battleships. The torpedoes they carried were the product of 6 months of training, countless adjustments, engineering solutions to problems that experts said couldn't be solved. Now, those solutions were being tested in combat. The torpedoes dropped, hit the water, stabilized at shallow depth, and ran straight toward their targets. When they struck, each explosion tore enormous holes in ship hulls designed to withstand punishment, but never imagining attack would come from the air in a supposedly safe harbor. The battleship Oklahoma was moored on the outboard side of Battleship Row. She took 3 torpedoes in the first minutes of the attack. The explosions blasted holes 15 feet across in her port side. Water flooded in with devastating speed. The ship began listing almost immediately. Crew members, many still in their bunks moments before, struggled to reach topside as the deck tilted beneath them. More torpedoes struck. 9 in total slammed into Oklahoma's hull. The ship rolled over completely, her bottom turning skyward in less than 12 minutes. Over 400 men were trapped inside when she capsized. West Virginia, moored inboard of Oklahoma, took 7 torpedoes. Her captain, Mervyn Bennion, remained on the bridge directing damage control, even after fragments from a bomb explosion tore into his abdomen. He refused to leave his post, insisted that others could be saved before him. He died, there, still giving orders, still trying to save his ship. West Virginia settled to the harbour bottom in relatively shallow water, her decks awash but not capsized. Over 100 men died in her flooding compartments. Arizona was moored with Vestal, a repair ship, alongside. At 8:06, 18 minutes into the attack, a modified 16-inch shell dropped by a high-level bomber struck Arizona forward of her No. 2 turret. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded in the forward magazine, where hundreds of tons of powder for the 14-inch guns was stored. The explosion was cataclysmic. The forward part of the ship simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the 40,000-ton battleship out of the water. Men on nearby ships were knocked off their feet by the concussion. A fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. When it cleared, Arizona was a burning, shattered wreck. Over 1,000 men died in that single explosion, more than half the total American casualties for the entire attack. The ship burns still, oil leaking from her hull even now, 84 years later, a grave for those who remain entombed within. Tennessee and Maryland, moored inboard against Ford Island, were partially protected by the ships outboard of them. They took bomb hits but no torpedoes, suffering damage but remaining afloat. California took 2 torpedoes and settled slowly to the harbour bottom. Nevada, at the northern end of Battleship Row, was the only battleship to get underway during the attack. Her crew managed to raise steam and cast off her moorings. As she moved down the channel toward the harbour entrance, every Japanese pilot who could reach her attacked. The battleship took multiple bomb and torpedo hits but kept moving, her guns firing at attacking aircraft. Finally, To avoid blocking the channel if she sank, Nevada deliberately ran aground at Hospital Point, Pennsylvania, in dry dock, and protected by the dry dock's massive concrete walls, escaped with relatively minor damage. Of the 8 battleships present, Arizona was destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Oklahoma had capsized. West Virginia, California, and Nevada were on the harbor bottom. Only Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Maryland remained operational, and even they had suffered damage that would take weeks to repair. But the battleships were not the only targets. Dive bombers attacked airfields across Oahu, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Bellows Field, Kaneohe Naval Air Station all came under assault. Japanese fighters strafed parked aircraft while dive bombers struck hangars and support facilities. The American planes, parked in neat rows to prevent sabotage, became perfect targets. Explosions rippled across flight lines. Aircraft burned or exploded. Of 390 aircraft on Oahu that morning, 188 were destroyed and 159 damaged. The planes that might have pursued the Japanese fleet or defended against the attack were reduced to burning wreckage in minutes. American response was heroic but disorganized. Individual sailors and soldiers fought back with whatever weapons they could reach. Machine gunners fired at attacking planes with no central coordination, simply shooting at any aircraft within range. Some pilots managed to take off and engage Japanese aircraft. Second Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor flew P-40 Warhawks from Haleiwa Field and shot down 7 enemy planes between them. But these were isolated actions. There was no coordinated defense, no prepared response. Everything happened too fast, with too little warning. The second wave arrived at 8:54, 170 aircraft bringing fresh attacks. They found a harbor now alert, with anti-aircraft fire filling the sky. American gunners, having overcome their initial shock, were firing everything they had. The second wave focused on targets, missed by the first, ships that escaped damage, airfields that needed further suppression, shore facilities. The dive bombers were particularly effective, coming at steep angles that made them difficult targets while giving them clear shots at ships below. By 9:45, it was over. The last Japanese aircraft departed, heading north to rendezvous with the carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor burned. The harbor was covered in oil from ruptured fuel tanks, and much of it was on fire. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, visible from miles away. Ships listed or lay capsized. Debris floated everywhere. The sounds of explosions from cooking off ammunition echoed across the base. Rescue efforts were already underway, men diving into burning oil to pull survivors from the water, cutting through ship hulls to reach trapped sailors. The statistics were staggering. 21 ships sunk or damaged, including all 8 battleships present. 188 aircraft. Destroyed, 159 damaged. 2,403 Americans killed. Another 1,178 wounded. In 110 minutes, Japan had crippled American naval power in the Pacific. The operation had succeeded beyond anything Yamamoto had dared hope. The Pacific Fleet would need months to recover, giving Japan free rein to execute their southern operations. Yet, even as the attack succeeded tactically, it failed strategically in ways that would prove fatal. 3 aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were not in harbor that morning. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was near Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego. These carriers, which would prove to be the decisive weapons of the Pacific War, escaped untouched. Even more critically, the oil storage tanks at Pearl Harbor, holding millions of gallons of fuel, were not targeted. The repair facilities, the dry docks, the maintenance shops, all he survived largely intact. Japan had sunk battleships, but they had not destroyed Pearl Harbor as a functioning base. Commander Fuchida, circling above the harbor in the attack's final minutes, considered launching a third wave. The targets were still there: fuel tanks, repair facilities, the submarines that had escaped damage. But Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier force, refused. The element of surprise was gone. American forces were alert now. The longer the carriers remained near Hawaii, the greater the risk of counterattack. The mission was accomplished. Time to withdraw. It was a conservative decision, cautious and defensive. It was also a mistake that would cost Japan dearly in the months ahead. But the greatest failure was not tactical. It was diplomatic. The attack was supposed to come after Japan delivered a declaration of war. The Foreign Ministry had sent a 14-part message to their embassy in Washington, instructing that it be typed, translated, and delivered to the State Department at 1 o'clock Washington time, which was 7:30 Hawaiian time 30 minutes before the attack. This timing would have made Pearl Harbor a surprise attack, certainly, but not a sneak attack. There would have been a declaration, formal and proper, before the bombs fell. The embassy staff, however, struggled with the message. It was long, complex, and had to be translated and typed. The work took longer than expected. Typing errors required corrections. By the time Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu delivered the message to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, it was 2:20 Washington time. The attack had been underway for over an hour. Hull had already received reports of the Pearl Harbor attack. When the ambassadors handed him the message, he read it, then looked at them with contempt. "In all my 50 years of public service," he said, "I've never seen a document that was more crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions." The timing, disaster transformed everything. What Japan intended as a bold military strike became, in American eyes, a treacherous sneak attack. The date December 7th, 1941 would be remembered, not as a day of military action but as a day of infamy. President Roosevelt would use that word in his speech to Congress the next day, and it would stick. Japan had not just attacked America. They had attacked without warning, without honor, killing men while their diplomats spoke of peace in Washington. The distinction between surprise attack and sneak attack might seem minor, but it was everything. It guaranteed that America would never accept anything less than Japan's complete and unconditional surrender. In Tokyo, Yamamoto received reports of the attack's success. Ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, casualties inflicted. His staff celebrated, but Yamamoto did not join the celebrations. He had studied America. He understood what he had unleashed. "I fear all we have done," he said, "is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." It was not just a prediction, it was the truth, and he knew it. Japan had won a tactical victory. They had bought themselves 6 months of freedom to operate in the Pacific, but they had also guaranteed that America would mobilize every resource, commit every factory, sacrifice whatever necessary to destroy Japan completely. The mathematics of desperation that drove Japan to attack had not changed. America still possessed overwhelming industrial superiority. Japan had just given America the motivation to use it. In those 110 minutes, everything changed. The careful diplomatic dance between Japan and America was over. The debate about intervention in the war was over. American isolationism died with the men at Pearl Harbor. The question of whether Japan could secure resources through negotiation was answered with fire and blood. The gambler's throw had succeeded tactically and failed strategically. Japan had run wild, exactly as Yamamoto predicted they would. But the clock was ticking on those 6 months of freedom, and at the end of that time, America would be coming with all the terrible resolve that a sleeping giant could muster. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt learned of the attack at 1:40 Washington time. He was having lunch when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called with the first reports. Ships sinking, men dying, the Pacific Fleet burning in its own harbor. Roosevelt's response was immediate and controlled. He began making calls, summoning advisors, gathering information, but inside, he must have felt something close to relief. The decision about whether to enter the war, which had paralyzed American politics for 2 years, had just been made for him. America, in 1941, was a nation deeply divided about the war raging across Europe and Asia. Yes, most Americans sympathized with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. Yes, they were disturbed by Japanese aggression in China. But sympathy did not mean willingness to fight. Polls consistently showed that 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. They remembered the Great War, the trenches, the poison gas, the million dead for no clear purpose. They had no desire to repeat that experience. America would sell weapons to the Allies, certainly, but American boys would not die in foreign wars. This was the overwhelming sentiment. Roosevelt disagreed. He believed that Nazi Germany posed an existential threat to democracy. He believed that Japanese expansion threatened American interests in Asia. He maneuvered constantly to support Britain, pushing the limits of neutrality with programs like Lend-Lease that provided weapons and supplies to Britain without requiring payment. But he could not bring America into the war directly. Congress would not authorize it. The people would not support it. He was trapped by democratic constraints, watching the world slide toward catastrophe while unable to act. Pearl Harbor changed everything in the span of a morning. The isolationist movement, which had been powerful enough to dictate foreign policy, collapsed completely. The America First Committee, which had counted hundreds of thousands of members and influential leaders like Charles Lindbergh, dissolved within days. The debate was over. Japan had attacked American soil, killed American servicemen, destroyed American ships. There was no more room for argument about whether America should fight. The only question was how completely America would commit to Japan's destruction. Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8th at 12:30 in the afternoon, less than 24 hours after the attack. His speech lasted just over 6 minutes. 32 minutes if you count the interruptions for applause. The opening line became instant history. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of Card. America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. He detailed the attacks, Pearl Harbor, but also simultaneous strikes on Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway. Japan had not just attacked Hawaii. They had launched a coordinated offensive across the entire Pacific in a single day. The scale of aggression was staggering. Roosevelt built his case methodically, each fact another nail in the coffin of isolationism. Then he came to the resolution. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote was nearly unanimous. The Senate approved 82-0. The House voted 388-1. The single dissenting vote came from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against entering World War I. She cast her vote in tears, knowing it would end her political career. It did. But that single vote was the only resistance. In every other respect, American unity was absolute. The nation that had been 80% opposed to war 24 hours earlier was now 100% committed to it. The transformation went beyond mere declaration. It was psychological, cultural, spiritual even. Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry, a symbol of treachery that justified any sacrifice. Remember Pearl Harbor appeared on posters, in newspapers, in recruitment offices. Young men lined up to enlist in numbers that overwhelmed recruiting stations. The military had to turn people away and ask them to come back later. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, enlistment rates increased 500%. Everyone wanted to fight. Everyone wanted revenge. But rage alone does not win wars. Industrial capacity wins wars, and America possessed industrial capacity beyond anything Japan had imagined. The numbers are almost absurd in their disparity. In 1940, before Pearl Harbor, American factories produced 3,000 aircraft. This was peacetime production, civilian economy humming along with minimal military investment. After Pearl Harbor, those same factories retooled for war production. By 1944, American factories were producing 300,000 aircraft per year. 300,000. That is not a typo. America increased aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. The same pattern repeated across every category of military production. Shipyards that had built a handful of vessels per year began launching ships by the hundreds. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, perfected mass production techniques that allowed them to build a Liberty ship 10,000 tons of cargo vessel in an average of 42 days. The record was 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. America built 2,700 Liberty ships during the war. Japan built roughly 400 merchant vessels total. America replaced shipping losses faster than submarines could sink them. Tank production followed similar trajectories. The United States produced 88,000 tanks during the war. Japan produced about 6,000. American factories made 2.6 million trucks. Japan made a few tens of thousands. The disparity extended to every weapon, every bullet, every piece of equipment. When the American industrial machine fully engaged, it produced materiel at rates that made conventional military planning obsolete. You do not fight battles the same way when you know that any losses can be replaced in weeks while your enemy needs years. Consider what this meant in practice. Japan began the war with 10 aircraft carriers, the largest carrier force in the world. America began with 7. By war's end, America had built or commissioned more than 100 carriers of various types. Japan managed to complete 8 more during the entire war. At the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. These were veteran ships with experienced crews. Replacing them took years and could never fully restore the skilled pilots and crew who died. When America lost Lexington at the Coral Sea and Yorktown at Midway, new carriers were already under construction. The losses barely registered in America's overall naval power. This industrial dominance meant that Japan's initial victories, spectacular as they were, meant almost nothing in strategic terms. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan ran wild exactly as Yamamoto had predicted. They conquered the Philippines, defeating American and Filipino forces after bitter fighting. They took Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, in 7 days. They occupied the Dutch East Indies, securing the oil fields that had driven them to war in the first place. They pushed into Burma, threatened India, established a defensive perimeter that stretched from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. It was one of the most successful military campaigns in history, but it was all temporary. Every island captured had to be defended, every ship lost could not be replaced, every experienced pilot killed was irreplaceable. Japan was spending capital while America was accumulating it. The fundamental mathematics that had driven Japan to war had not changed. They still could not match American industrial capacity. All they had done was start the clock on America's mobilization. The turning point came at Midway in June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes and knew the attack was coming. American carriers ambushed the Japanese fleet. In the span of 5 minutes, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck 3 Japanese carriers, turning them into burning wrecks. A fourth carrier was destroyed. Later that day, Japan lost 248 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. America lost one carrier and about 150 planes. The exchange rate was unsustainable for Japan. They had traded 4 fleet carriers for one. They had lost veteran pilots who had trained for years and could not be replaced quickly. The strategic initiative in the Pacific passed to America that day and never returned to Japan. After Midway, the war became a grinding march across the Pacific. Island by island, atoll by atoll, American forces pushed toward Japan. Each battle followed a pattern. American forces would land with overwhelming support. Naval gunfire that could reduce installations to rubble, air support that controlled the skies, supplies that seemed limitless. Japanese forces would resist with fanatical courage, dying almost to the last man rather than surrendering. Then American forces would move on while Japan struggled to scrape together resources to defend the next island. The casualty rates were horrific, but tell the strategic story clearly. At Tarawa in November 1943, American Marines suffered over 3,000 casualties taking a tiny atoll, but they took it in 76 hours. At Saipan in June 1944, American forces lost 3,000 dead while Japan lost 30,000, including most of the civilian population. At Iwo Jima, the Americans suffered 27,000 casualties, but Japan lost 21,000 killed. At Okinawa, American casualties exceeded 50,000, but Japan lost over 100,000 military and civilian dead. The pattern was consistent. Japan fought with desperate courage, but America could replace losses while Japan could not. By late 1944, American bombers were reaching Japan itself. The B-29 Superfortress, designed specifically for the Pacific War, could carry massive bomb loads over enormous distances. They began with precision bombing of military targets, but as Japanese air defenses proved stubborn, tactics shifted to area bombing of cities. On the night of March 9, 1945, 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The resulting firestorm killed over 100,000 people in a single night, more than would die in either atomic bombing. Similar raids followed against other cities. Japan's industrial capacity, already stretched thin, collapsed under the assault, yet Japan refused to surrender. The military government in Tokyo believed that if they could make invasion costly enough, America might accept negotiated peace rather than complete conquest. They prepared for homeland defense, training civilians to fight with bamboo spears, hiding aircraft and supplies for suicide attacks, fortifying beaches. The plans called for every Japanese citizen to resist to the death. Casualty estimates for an American invasion of Japan ran to millions of dead on both sides. Then came the atomic bombs. Hiroshima on August 6th, Nagasaki on August 9th. Each weapon destroyed a city in seconds, killed tens of thousands instantly, and demonstrated that America could now obliterate Japanese cities without risking a single pilot. The calculus of resistance changed. Fighting bravely was one thing. Fighting when your cities could be erased by single bombs was pointless. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. Many Japanese heard their emperor's voice for the first time. He told them the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. It was the understatement of the century. Japan had been destroyed so completely that they would spend the next decade recovering under American occupation. From Pearl Harbor to surrender, 3 years and 8 months. In that time, American industrial democracy had demonstrated a terrible truth. Given sufficient motivation, a democratic industrial power can mobilize resources on a scale that makes conventional military power almost irrelevant. Japan had won the first battle. They had destroyed the battleships at Pearl Harbor. but those battleships were obsolete before they sank. The real war would be decided by carriers, aircraft, and the industrial base to produce them endlessly. Japan had gambled that one devastating blow would break American will. Instead, it unified American purpose and unleashed American power. Yamamoto had been right. They had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had crushed them. History does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. The pattern that drove Japan to Pearl Harbor, resource dependency, great power competition, the mathematics of desperation did not die with Japan's surrender. It shifted, mutated, and reappeared in different forms. Today, those same forces shape conflicts from the South China Sea to Ukraine, making Pearl Harbor not just history, but a warning about patterns that nations ignore at their peril. Consider modern China. They are the world's second largest economy, a rising power with global ambitions and a military that grows more capable each year. They have built artificial islands in the South China Sea, militarized them with airstrips and missile batteries, and claimed waters that international law says belong to no one. They have threatened Taiwan repeatedly, conducted military exercises that simulate invasion, and made clear their intention to reunify the island with the mainland, by force if necessary. Western analysts watch these developments with growing alarm, seeing echoes of Imperial Japan's expansion in the 1930s. But the comparison that should terrify us is not the expansion itself. It is the resource dependency. China imports 85% of its oil. Most of that oil passes through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow channel between Malaysia and Indonesia. It is one of the world's most critical choke points, and it is nowhere near China. American naval power could close that strait in hours. A handful of submarines could strangle China's energy supply without firing a shot at the Chinese mainland. China knows this. They calculate the mathematics just as Japanese planners did in 1941. They see the vulnerability and understand what it means. This is why China has pursued the Belt and Road Initiative with such determination, building ports and pipelines across Asia and Africa. They are trying to diversify their supply routes, to create alternatives to the sea lanes that America could close. It is why they have built the world's largest navy by hull count, trying to project power far enough from their shores to protect their maritime lifelines. It is why they have developed hypersonic missiles designed to sink aircraft carriers, attempting to push American naval power away from the waters they need to control. Every action is driven by the same fear that drove Japan: dependence on resources that flow through spaces, controlled by potential enemies. Taiwan represents the same kind of strategic calculation that Korea represented for Imperial Japan. The island sits less than 100 miles from the Chinese mainland. If China controlled Taiwan, they would dominate the first island chain, the string of territories from Japan through the Philippines that currently limits Chinese naval power. Taiwan is also the world's leading producer of advanced semiconductors, manufacturing over 60% of the world's chips and over 90% of the most advanced ones. Controlling Taiwan would give China dominance over the technology that powers everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. The strategic value is almost incalculable, yet attacking Taiwan would mean war with the United States, which has committed, though ambiguously, to Taiwan's defense. China would face the same impossible calculation that Japan faced in 1941. Can we win a war against a power with superior industrial capacity? Can we secure what we need quickly enough that the enemy accepts fait accompli rather than prolonged conflict? Is there a knockout blow that would break American will the way Pearl Harbor was supposed to? Chinese military planners study these questions intensely. They also study how Pearl Harbor failed, how it unified rather than divided America, how it guaranteed total war rather than negotiated peace. The parallels extend beyond Asia. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 followed similar logic of desperation, dressed as strength. Russia saw NATO expansion as an existential threat, Western influence in Ukraine as intolerable, and time as working against them. Better to strike now while they still could than wait until Ukraine joined NATO and became untouchable. Better to present the world with a quick victory than allow slow encirclement. The calculation failed, as such calculations usually do, but the pattern was familiar: a declining power using military force to secure what it fears losing through other means. Resource competition adds accelerant to all these tensions. Rare earth elements, essential for electronics and military systems, are concentrated in a few locations, with China controlling much of the processing capacity. Lithium for batteries is scarce and unevenly distributed. Water resources face increasing pressure from climate change and population growth. Even food security, which seemed solved by industrial agriculture, now appears fragile in the face of drought, conflict, and supply chain disruption. Every resource that nations depend on but cannot produce domestically is a potential trigger for conflict when access becomes threatened. Climate change multiplies these pressures in ways we are only beginning to understand. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities and island nations. Changing rainfall patterns disrupt agriculture in regions where millions depend on subsistence farming. Heat waves make parts of Paris, the world, increasingly uninhabitable. As resources become scarcer and populations more desperate, the mathematics of conflict shift. Nations that once could prosper through trade may find themselves contemplating force as the only way to secure what their people need to survive. The lesson of Pearl Harbor is not that resource-dependent nations should never fight. The lesson is that desperation makes nations do irrational things while believing they are being rational. Japanese leaders in 1941 knew they probably could not win a prolonged war with America. They attacked anyway because the alternative seemed worse. They believed that decisive action could overcome fundamental disadvantages. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but the logic that drove them made sense within their framework of understanding. Modern nations face similar temptations. When you calculate that you have 18 months of oil reserves, when you see strategic resources controlled by potential enemies, when you watch your options narrow year by year, the pressure to act becomes overwhelming. The fact that action will probably fail does not make it less tempting. Desperate people make desperate choices, and nations are just collections of people operating under pressure. This is why Pearl Harbor matters today, not as a historical curiosity about battleships and bombs, but as a case study in how rational actors can make catastrophic decisions. Every element that drove Japan to war exists in today's world: resource scarcity, great power competition, rising nationalism, declining powers fearful of losing status, rising powers impatient to claim what they believe is rightfully theirs. The specific details change, but the underlying dynamics remain constant. Consider the decisions facing Chinese leadership over the next decade. Taiwan is not going to voluntarily reunify with the mainland. American military presence in Asia is not going away. China's dependence on imported resources is not going to decrease. Meanwhile, China's population is aging, their economic growth is slowing, and the window of maximum military advantage may be closing. Does China strike now while they are relatively strong, or wait and hope that time somehow works in their favor? It is the same calculation Japan faced, updated for modern circumstances. Or consider smaller powers caught between great power competition. Nations in Southeast Asia must choose between Chinese economic influence and American security guarantees. Middle Eastern countries calculate whether to align with traditional Western partners or new powers offering different arrangements. Every nation with scarce resources and powerful neighbors faces some version of Japan's dilemma: submit, adapt, or fight. The choices are rarely clear, the outcomes seldom certain. The international system that failed to prevent Pearl Harbor has evolved, but not fundamentally changed. We have the United Nations instead of the League of Nations, nuclear weapons instead of battleships, global supply chains instead of colonial empires. But the basic problem remains: how do we manage competition between nations with different resources, different values, and different visions of world order, without that competition escalating to war? We have not solved this problem. We have merely made the stakes higher. Nuclear weapons were supposed to make major war impossible through mutual assured destruction. Yet nuclear powers have fought proxy wars repeatedly. They have come close to direct conflict multiple times. The logic of deterrence assumes rational actors making calculated decisions. But Pearl Harbor teaches us that desperate actors do not always behave rationally, at least not by outside standards. A nation facing collapse may calculate that even nuclear war is preferable to certain defeat without fighting. The mathematics of desperation can overwhelm any deterrent. So, what do we do with these patterns? How do we break the cycle that leads from resource competition to great power rivalry to desperate gambles that kill millions? There are no simple answers. We can build international institutions that manage resource distribution more equitably. We can develop technologies that reduce dependence on scarce materials. We can create security arrangements that give nations confidence they can prosper without conquest. All of these help, but none guarantee peace. What we cannot do is ignore the patterns. We cannot pretend that because we have seen this before, it cannot happen again. Every generation thinks their technology, their institutions, their wisdom has made past catastrophes impossible. Then, catastrophe arrives anyway, wearing new clothes but following old patterns. The ships are different now, the weapons more destructive, the communications instant rather than delayed by telegraph and embassy typing pools. But the human calculations, the fears and ambitions and desperate mathematics, those remain constant. Pearl Harbor succeeded in its immediate objective. Japan crippled the Pacific Fleet, bought 6 months of freedom to operate, seized the resources they desperately needed. And all of it meant nothing because they had miscalculated the fundamental equation. Tactical success cannot overcome strategic impossibility. Winning battles does not matter if you cannot win the war. Short-term gains disappear in the face of long-term disadvantages. Japan learned this at the cost of millions of lives and utter destruction. The question facing us today is whether other nations will learn from that example or repeat it with even more devastating weapons. Stand on the memorial built over Arizona's hull at Pearl Harbor. Look down through the water at the rusting metal where over 1,000 men remain entombed. Oil still leaks from the ship, rising to the surface in rainbow swirls that mark the grave of those who died that Sunday morning. They died because nations made calculations about resources and power and decided that war was the answer to their problems. Those calculations were wrong, but by the time everyone realized it, millions were dead and cities were ashes. The patterns persist: resource dependency, great power competition, the mathematics of desperation. They are active in the South China Sea, where navies shadow each other through contested waters. They simmer in Eastern Europe, where energy pipelines determine political alignments. They shape decisions in capitals around the world, where leaders calculate what they can take, what they must defend, and what price they are willing to pay. Pearl Harbor is not just history. It is prophecy, waiting to repeat itself in some new form unless we learn what it tried to teach us. That lesson is simple but hard to accept. There are no shortcuts to security, no surprise attack that ends a conflict quickly, no resource seizure that solves fundamental dependencies, no amount of military power that overcomes basic strategic reality. Japan tried all of these and failed completely. Yet nations continue to make similar calculations, believing their situation is different, their strategy superior, their enemies less resolute. Sometimes they are right, and quick victories do work. But when they are wrong, when they miscalculate as badly as Japan did, the price is measured in generations lost and nations destroyed. The ships that burned at Pearl Harbor are gone now, salvaged or left as memorials. The men who died there are remembered on walls and in ceremonies. The war they died in has passed into history. But the forces that drove that war remain active, shaping our world, pushing nations toward decisions that may determine whether our civilization survives or joins past empires in the ruins of history. Pearl Harbor is not just a date to remember. It is a pattern to recognize and a warning to heed. The mathematics of desperation are eternal. The question is whether we are wise enough to change the equation before it forces us to solve it through war again.